Italy, but not just Italy. So, in order to have an international perspective, we move on to Shanghai and then we'll go back to Italy and we'll have the executives from the main areas that will share with us the situation in this moment. But now let us move on to Shanghai, and this is going to be in English. So for those of you that need translation, please stay in the Italian channel. Those that want to follow the contribution in English, it is possible to use the English channel in order to get it. Okay. I'll say comfortable for our next speaker.
So let me introduce to all of you Mr. Sean Yang, General Manager di Shentou. So, hello Mr. Yang.
Hi, good morning everybody.
It's a great pleasure having you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, you're a really important expert in strategies on global supply chain management, and these must be very interesting times for you.
Absolutely, a very interesting time. Well, my topic actually today is precisely the transformation of the supply chain for the global aftermarket, especially in the face of COVID-19. And I'm very pleased to share with you some of the observations we've seen so far. Next, first slide helps us review the difficult year of 2020, especially the serious disruptions of COVID-19 to the global supply chain of aftermarket. The first chart on the left is the daily confirmed cases of COVID-19 from January 23rd, the date when China locked down the entire city of Wuhan, to the end of October. It is clear that after the initial virus breakout in China in the middle of February, Europe was getting hit next by late March, and shortly after, the virus started to spread in the US in early April. We can see from the chart on the right, after the gradual recovery of China, the Chinese export to the US and European unions started to slowly rise from March to May, as the US and Europe was just seeing the spread of the virus. From May of this year, the Chinese export to the US and Europe have been increasing, but at a slower pace. Now, while the export volume to the US increased a lot faster than that of Europe, the ups and downs of the exports to Europe unions pretty much match the trend of the case count in the region. With the next slide, let us look at some of the impact of COVID-19 on the supply chain. Now, as much of the world used to depend heavily on the automotive production basis in China, the impact of COVID-19 on China's automotive industry and consequently on the global supply chains, especially during the early stage of the spread in China, were indeed wide-ranging and very serious. Now, the industry in China and many Asian countries have mostly recovered, but much of the impact of COVID-19 are still felt today across the world. And they might be getting more serious as we head into the year-end holidays and the winter seasons. So for example, travel restrictions. Well, I'm pretty sure many people watching this presentation are really missing the constant business trips we were so used to, actually. Production disruptions. Well, productions in China and many other countries have stopped in the height of the pandemic. Fortunately, almost all factories in China have gradually returned to normal by April. And globally, more and more productions are also getting back to on track. But the unbalanced pandemic developments across the world and the related economic activities in different regions have also brought us many new challenges. As for example, here in China, because of the early recovery and also the very active government actions to encourage the economic revival, we now see actually the impact of the booming domestic business actually crowding out businesses from overseas customers to a point where the productions for international orders have to give way to domestic orders. This has also led to rising material costs. The pandemic has also accelerated the changes in the general labor market in China. More and more people are now thinking of moving away from the more industrial regions back to their hometown. resulting in very serious labor shortages in many places, actually. Our shipping cancellations and delays. Well, this is a very serious and ongoing situation as we speak. Right now, a booking, for example, for a container shipment to the US have to be made from 1 week to 3 or almost 4 weeks in advance. And you'll be lucky if you can get, booking the date you've planned. It's also not uncommon for loaded containers to sit at the departure ports for days or even weeks after the scheduled departure date. In order to reduce the shipping costs, we see that shipping companies are having their ships make multiple transits, and the shipping times obviously extended for sometimes over 15 days or more. And when the containers do arrive in the destinations, there's actually no telling how long it will take to be cleared and delivered to its final destinations because of the large number of accumulated unprocessed containers and labor shortages because of the virus. We're now actually hearing stories every single day about a huge volume of containers waiting to be processed at the US or European ports, as well as the empty containers sitting there, while there are simply not enough empty containers to be found in China. Skyrocketing shipping costs. While the shipping costs have been going up constantly during the pandemic, now they are literally going through the roof. Cost for a 24 container from China to West Coast US increased from a little more than like US $2,000 to over 4,000, even higher, a lot higher. Cost for 24 containers from China to Germany increased from about 1,000 to like 3,000. So everywhere the shipping costs are increasing. And we're seeing volatile exchange rates. The intertwined economic and geopolitical uncertainties have also resulted in extremely volatile changes of the currencies. The exchange rates for US dollars to RMB, Chinese yuan, has appreciated from a little over 7 at pre-pandemic to almost now like 6.5 now, almost 8-point appreciation of the local currency. And this change is obviously giving significant changes to supplies in China and also buyers outside China on top of COVID-19 impact. Well, next, let's discuss some of the lessons we've learned. Obviously, there are many lessons to be learned in terms of the supply chain and during this prolonged global crisis. And I think the two lessons, lack of or weak digitalization and heavy supply chain concentration, are particularly relevant. These lessons these issues are not new, but the reality is many companies are still very, very slow in implementing some degree of digitalization and strategically diversifying their supply bases. So lesson number one, a weak digitalization. Now, digitalization is really a fancy word that is often talked about, but too many companies tend to just put it aside and just go about their routine operations other than having a good corporate website. As a result, we see many companies have no or very weak presence other than a website. When a year-long and global health crisis such as COVID-19 hit us, we can see that most companies in e-commerce are actually doing exceptionally well. Also, companies with strong web presence are generally doing better than companies without. And we know many of these companies are actually seeing substantial business growth year over year during COVID-19. Lesson number two, a heavy supplier concentration. Now, it's obvious from the recent experience that a regionalized or diversified supply chain would work to the strategic advantages of the business. We've already heard lots of discussions on this from the buyer's point of view. We are now also seeing the same thinking shared by people from the supply side, as more and more manufacturing companies, including those in China, are adjusting their international expansion plans. In fact, even before the pandemic, we already saw wide adoptions of local for local concept that is demanded by OEMs and executed by their first-tier suppliers, where the suppliers are required to set up shops close to different OEM facilities in different markets. Now, the local for local practice and concept in OEM business are made necessary primarily by consideration of costs, production lead time, and geopolitical factors. Now, COVID-19 has also made the aftermarket business community to focus on the same strategy as well. So we think we can expect more business plannings and activities in this area. The next slide is a simple view of a typical supply chain management process, which includes planning, supply chain development, such as supply identification and qualification, purchasing, order processing, quality management, transportation, warehousing, and inventory. Now, with these, so now let's take a look, a detailed look at each process and discuss some of the challenges posed by COVID-19, and also some of the emerging trends and solutions we are seeing. First, let's look at planning. With the impact COVID-19, market demands have become unpredictable. Companies with the right product portfolio and web presence actually saw their market demands increase so high and so quickly that they soon ran out of their stock. As we discussed earlier, a heavily concentrated supply base would easily lead to unexpected supply chain disruptions. Many companies depend on their supplies almost entirely in China. So when China's productions, indeed, the whole country will put on hold in February and March, people outside China became panicked. However, when China was just about ready to resume the productions and shipments, the global spread of the virus put a hold on the demand side. So now it was the Chinese suppliers who were now panicked. Obviously, the lack of digitalization and weak preparedness have made the challenges even worse. Therefore, we see demand now for a more diversified and a regionalized supply base, as well as a better digitalized infrastructure. And these and many other issues have actually forced businesses to make strategic adjustments in their supply chain management planning, especially for a cross-border procurement. Let's discuss this next, the supply development. The lack of supplier development, the task has become one of the immediate headache for many international buyers during the pandemic. Most European businesses don't have this office in China. So it used to be that when they want to find new supplies, they would first of all do some online search, and then they would travel to China to attend various trade shows, meet potential suppliers, and do some preliminary factory visits, and then they return to Europe. The communications and negotiations then continue with phone calls, emails, and perhaps to be followed by another trip for factory inspections and audits. Well, with COVID-19, borders are closed, even to this date. And when they can travel, restrictions are everywhere. Realistically, with the current pandemic status, we expect that it will be quite some time before the Chinese suppliers can visit their customers overseas, and many European buyers will not be able or unwilling to make international travels, and now or probably for the foreseeable future. So faced with these challenges, we've noticed a fundamental change by the automotive communities on how to conduct their businesses when it comes to supply development. There are wide adoptions of new technology, new business practices, which made possible by new technologies such as cloud-based computing, improvement in communications, networks, devices, and very advanced live streaming applications. Next is the purchasing and order processing. Now, international buyers often complain about higher MOQs, or minimum order quantity, required by factories, which now also represent a higher risk of excessive inventories, especially in time of crisis. We think that programs such as group purchasing could help reduce the problems of MOQs. And many international buyers prefer to avoid, at this point, a large volume purchases, or they're not always able to purchase in full container loads. And we expect to see more companies would order probably in LCL shipments, and then multiple LCL orders would from different buyers would be consolidated by service providers for a full container load shipment to Europe. Next, quality management, which is a very critical component of a sound supply chain. Now, it used to be that when it's time for factory audits and pre-shipment inspections, European buyers would organize a trip to China. They would then go to several factories one by one, and personally conduct on-site audits and inspections. Although this involved additional costs, buyers would always feel a lot more comfortable, especially when it comes to new suppliers or new products. Well, again, with the threat of COVID-19, some companies are now willing to conduct virtual audits where factories are still being audited on site by local service providers, and international buyers would remotely monitor and participate in the process with video conferencing. Sometimes the on-site audits or inspections of the key process by the service providers on site are simply live streamed to Europe. Now, for quality controls such as pre-shipment inspections, again, local inspectors in China can still do the inspection at the factory, and buyers in Europe would remotely monitor with live streaming. Next is the transportation. So here the problems are serious and obvious. Earlier, we discussed the current very serious situation of ocean transportation. Now, even if those year-end issues are unique and temporary, COVID-19 has already made many companies to rethink their transportation arrangements in their supply chain and try to find a proper balance between efficiency, costs, and risk avoidance for the shipment of their overseas purchases. Some companies have adopted new approaches. For example, there are now direct rail services between China and Europe with shipping costs higher than ocean freight, but a lot lower than air freight. And the delivery time also considerably shorter. So for goods with higher value, it makes a lot of sense to ship the goods with China-Europe railways, and these extra costs are usually more than justified by the faster return of capitals. For some companies, especially those in e-commerce relying on or considering to use air shipments, there are demands for some kind of smart transfer where goods are still shipped from China to Europe or US with properly structured multi-transfer points in between to make the maximum use of the cost advantages of non-direct flights. And of course, another smart approach is to switch the production or supply sources to areas closer to the home market. So stable transportations with reasonable costs are manageable, even in times of crisis. Well, next, let's look at warehousing and inventory management. After COVID-19 hit the business communities, many companies have had serious issues with stagnant stocks and a lot overstocks. Even when all of us, we think, coming out of on the other side, we think businesses will still be very careful with their inventory management. As discussed earlier, a strong web presence, smart operations of purchasing and shipping consolidations, and a better and digitized tracking and tracing systems would all help in this situation. Well, the next slide shows that based on the above analysis, we believe COVID-19 has actually contributed to an upgrade of the traditional business model of supply chain management to a smart SCM. We now know for sure the traditional supply chain management has fundamentally changed how to develop and interact with suppliers, how to manage the supply qualification and QA and QC process, how to ensure the cross-border purchasing is efficient, cost-effective, with the lowest risks, and how to better control the inventory. These are some of the questions that have to be addressed even when the world is gradually coming out of the pandemic. Unfortunately, the lessons we've learned, especially with digitalization and regionalizations, could effectively help us deal with these issues. Many companies are now adopting the use of digitalized documentation. They would have their company introductions or catalogs accessible by web links only, or other digital forms with no actual paper documents anymore. We also see the trend to move the promotion of the company image or even internal operations from computer-based to mobile device-based. The use of computer obviously, may not necessarily decrease, but the adoption of mobile device is certainly skyrocketing. So a smart strategy is really to make our supply chains more truly mobile device friendly and remote access enabled. To deal with COVID-19, many companies have also adopted various internet-based practice, as we discussed earlier, with web-based platforms or other digitalized approaches. such as online meetings, virtual factory visits, remote participation of on-site audits. These actions, however, are all taken usually without an overall plan. Now, we believe that these actions or practices would become part of standard business practice even when COVID-19 is finally over. So we expect that more companies, would have a dedicated part of its official website to host and consolidate all the standard interfaces for these functions in one place, rather than scattered around. The last slide shows the conceptual framework of smart SCM, or supply chain management, in the aftermath of COVID-19, which we call it the SCM C19. Now, in summary, with a post-COVID-19 smart business model of supply chain management that is supported by digitalization and assisted by partners on the ground, international business can still manage their global supply chains remotely, effectively, smoothly, and safely. Thank you.